Today, we are taking on a challenge that really sits at the core of all high-stakes performance: emotional control.
Yeah, and I think we need to be really clear from the start.
What's that?
Our mission here isn't about achieving some sort of, Zen-like state or learning how to suppress feeling. That's not the goal at all.
No, not at all. We're looking at something far more practical. It's about managing the emotion's timing and its output.
That distinction is everything. That difference between the internal feeling and the external output. Emotions are, well, they're brilliant signals, absolutely
They
necessary.
tell you where the danger is, right?
Exactly, or where your boundaries were just crossed, or where a massive opportunity might be. But, and this is the big but, for any leader, any decision maker, really any person under pressure, that initial burst of anger or fear is an absolutely terrible author of the final draft.
That's a great way to put it, the terrible author. Because the moment the pressure hits, I mean, whether it's a crisis on a national stage, a multi-million-dollar corporate recall, or just a deeply frustrating email from a colleague, the default human mechanism is to just discharge that emotion immediately.
Get it out.
Yeah, get it out. So our deep dive today is focused on finding that reliable friction point. How do people who operate at the highest levels, the ones who can't afford the luxury of a meltdown, how do they build a robust, repeatable protocol between that raw internal feeling and the ultimate external action?
And we've synthesized some incredible source material to figure that out. We're looking at historical crisis anecdotes, executive memoirs, and some deep psychological insights. And we've boiled it all down into 5 distinct and I think immediately applicable principles.
The goal really is to move you from those reactive decisions driven by the heat of the moment to deliberate choices that are guided by clarity.
And we'll get there using these incredible stories. I mean, we'll talk about Lincoln's private fury after Gettysburg, the psychological system that kept 33 miners coherent, 2,300 feet underground.
An unbelievable story.
And even the corporate shame of the Netflix Quickster reversal. All of these show what that discipline looks like when the stakes are genuinely existential.
So before we get to those stunning real-world applications, I think we have to look closely at the core problem here, and that's the impulsive brain. It's a mechanism that's designed for speed, not accuracy.
That's it. And the core emotional trap is that these high-octane emotions, particularly the stressful ones, they always come with this really attractive, immediate package of cognitive clarity.
What do you mean by that clarity?
Well, take anger, for instance. Anger hands you the gift of certainty. Suddenly you think, I know exactly who is wrong, what happened, and what must be done. It feels crystal clear.
And fear hands you urgency.
It hands you urgency. Act now, or it will be too late to salvage this. Shame hands you invisibility. Just hide this, and the consequences won't follow.
And the most compelling lie that all of them whisper is always the same one, isn't it?
Always. Act now. You'll feel better.
And for a second, you do. You execute the action, you vent the fury, you send that scathing reply, and for maybe 10 seconds, you do feel better. It's such an efficient emotional discharge.
That efficiency is the neurobiological problem we have to override. It's the brain's default auto-reply. Anger immediately leads to accusation. Anxiety immediately leads to reassurance seeking.
Frustration to sarcasm.
Exactly. It's fast, but it's guaranteed damage, because you are making a permanent decision based on a temporary emotional state.
So the goal of this entire deep dive is to introduce deliberate, repeatable friction into that chain. We're trying to replace that impulsive trajectory with 4 distinct steps that have to be practiced in sequence.
Right. We want to move from the raw emotion to a container, a safe externalized space to just hold the feeling,
And that container provides the necessary time.
which then naturally introduces perspective and objective data.
And only then, at the very end of that process, do we arrive at a conscious, deliberate choice.
The practice here is simple, but it's not easy. You have to practice putting the emotion in the container every single time. It's a psychological conditioning exercise. You just can't skip straight to the choice without first introducing that necessary delay.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of containment. And we can do that with one of the most powerful examples of self-discipline in American history, the unsent letter written by Abraham Lincoln. We're in Washington, D.C. It's the humid, anxious summer of 1863, right after the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg.
And the atmosphere was just toxic.
Yeah.
The Union had technically won. Yes, they halted Robert E. Lee's push north, but at a horrifying cost in human life.
Horrifying.
So the general feeling in Washington was this mix of exhaustion and real anticipation. They felt like they were on the precipice of ending the entire war.
Precisely. Lee's shattered Confederate army was retreating south, heading for the Potomac River. And this is where General George Meade, the Union commander, failed the president's expectation. Meade had this golden opportunity to launch a final, decisive attack while Lee was trapped near the flooded Potomac. But Meade hesitated. He let the Confederates slip away back across the river into Virginia.
You have to think about the context for Lincoln here. He is juggling this crushing political pressure, the immense weight of the war, and this endless stream of casualty lists. Men who had just died to create this single war-ending moment.
Yeah.
So when he hears that Meade allowed Lee to escape, he experienced what witnesses described as quiet fury. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was this deep, seismic anger of realizing that the entire catastrophe had just been prolonged. Maybe for years.
He actually described it later in a private note as an opportunity we had only to stretch forth our hands to grasp. And that feeling, that devastation, that the absolute final victory was just tossed aside by a subordinate's failure of nerve, that's where most leaders would just erupt.
Oh, absolutely, in some immediate career-ending judgment.
And Lincoln, being human, did what anyone would do. He wrote the letter.
He did. It starts with a nod to Meade's bravery in the battle, but it very quickly turns acidic. It details the sharp disappointment, the judgment that Meade had been overly cautious.
It essentially says, if you couldn't take action, then you will never be able to move him, basically dismissing his capacity to command ever again. It's brutal.
But here's the lesson. Here's the hinge moment we have to draw from. Lincoln finished the letter, he sealed the emotion, and he did not send it.
He didn't send it.
This letter was found years later among his private papers. It was an artifact of personal psychological processing. It was not a piece of military communication. He built the container, he put the white-hot emotion in it, and he closed the lid, choosing to let the urgency expire.
And that leads directly to our first principle. Contain first, decide second. But, this is where a skeptical listener might ask, how do we know Lincoln wasn't just suppressing that disappointment, until it became some kind of resentment that just leaked out later? Isn't writing it down just another form of bottling it up?
That's a critical and really challenging question. And the difference lies in the process of externalization.
Okay.
Suppression is an attempt to internalize the feeling, to shove it down. That requires constant energy, and it creates this internal pressure. When Lincoln wrote the letter, he externalized the fury. He moved the cognitive load of his grievance onto the physical page.
So the act of writing itself is part of the process.
It focuses the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, to organize the raw emotional data that's just pouring out of the amygdala.
The writing provided a safe release valve for all that energy.
Right. And the act of not sending it provided the cooling chamber. When you are operating from the heat of anger, your brain is functioning as a biased narrator. It's highly focused only on confirming your outrage.
Right. You're just looking for evidence that you're correct.
Exactly. Lincoln's delay allowed that intense certainty that the anger provided to just dissipate. He waited until that disappointment stopped being a weapon aimed at Meade, and instead it became a stable piece of data he could analyze calmly. He chose strategic effectiveness over emotional relief.
So if that gap, that cooling chamber, is the mechanism, we need the tools to enforce it. So let's look at the protocol for the modern professional. We can start with the draft rule.
This is mandatory friction for the digital age. I mean, we all feel it. You get that surge of emotional certainty, that urge to send the scathing text, the defensive response, the highly critical email. You must write the message. Write it exactly as you feel it. Totally uncensored, completely true to your emotion. Get the full discharge out onto the page of the screen.
But then, and this is the absolute non-negotiable step, save it as a draft. You have to wait a minimum of 30 minutes, but ideally overnight if the stakes are high. And then you walk away. That mandatory pause is where the neurological shift happens.
It is. During that 30-minute delay, the immediate neurochemistry of that emotional spike, the adrenaline, the cortisol, it starts to subside. When you return to the draft, you're no longer reading it as the victim or the aggressor who wrote it 10 minutes ago.
You're now reading it as the potential recipient.
Or as a rational third-party observer. And that crucial shift in perspective is just impossible to achieve in the moment of emotional flooding. The time acts as a solvent for that emotional urgency.
And so often when we're flooded, we feel this. this generalized chaos,
Yeah.
an urge to, as you put it in the outline, spray damage everywhere, just listing every perceived grievance in a messy, unfocused attack.
Yeah.
To counter that, we use the second tool. Name the trigger in one sentence.
This forces clarity. Before you write that long, rambling, destructive email, force yourself to write one single, uncensored sentence that defines the core grievance. I'm angry because their failure to review the contract by the deadline has jeopardized the entire project and made me look incompetent.
And that's it.
That's it. That process forces the brain to isolate the data point that's causing the reaction, rather than letting the emotion diffuse into these generalized attacks on someone's character.
Okay, so let's give the listener the micro steps for applying this immediately. Step 1. Open the draft, type the uncensored, painful sentence you desperately want to send, and then save it.
Step 2. Before you even allow yourself to edit anything, add one question at the very top of that draft, aimed directly at yourself. If I send this in its current form, what problem gets significantly worse?
Ooh, that's a good one.
That single question is highly rational. It forces the brain to calculate the negative downstream consequences, and it shifts your focus from immediate emotional relief to long-term risk management.
And then step 3, when you finally do go back to edit, don't just delete the whole thing, just rewrite the first 2 sentences. And you're aiming not for vengeance or for score settling, but purely for the outcome you actually want. What is the desired strategic or relational result here?
That is the hinge. The draft rule lets you put your emotion in the container, seal it safely, and only then do you earn the right to hit send. That is the essence of discipline.
Okay, moving on now to our second principle. We're shifting from this internal emotional containment to using external structure as a system of calm. And this comes from one of the most incredible, psychologically rigorous survival stories of our time. The San Jose mine collapse in Chile in 2010.
The environmental context here is so crucial to understand. We were talking about 33 men trapped about 700 meters. That's 2,300 feet underground.
So deep.
It's hot, it's dark, it's humid, and every single survival instinct is just screaming panic. The physical threats were against dehydration, structural failure, lack of food. But the most immediate dangerous enemy was the psychological threat of panic and despair.
Panic is a resource killer. I mean, it makes people fight over finite supplies. It makes them freeze into inaction or recklessly burn through their oxygen and their psychological reserves.
Right.
In a situation like this, you can't wait for clarity or for rescue. You have to create internal coherence first, because chaos underground rapidly leads to death.
And this is where the shift foreman, Luis Urzúa, emerged as the central emotional regulator. He realized that the greatest threat wasn't the rock above them, it was the psychological collapse within the group itself.
So before they even had communication with the surface, and certainly before they had any kind of rescue plan, he instituted this radical form of emotional survival. He organized reality.
He didn't wait for external authorization. He immediately took inventory of the scarce emergency food, which was meant for a 48-hour period, not a 2-month entombment.
Wow.
And he instituted a rigid rationing system. He assigned roles to every single man, creating shifts for mapping the area, for monitoring air quality, even for rudimentary sanitation.
This is a profound insight into crisis management, isn't it? The structure wasn't really about logistics.
No, it was emotion regulation. Routine creates predictability. Predictability creates agency. And agency, even in the smallest form like, I have a job to do today, is the counteragent to overwhelming panic. They held daily meetings. They sang the national anthem. And accounts from the survivors all noted this unusual level of unity despite the horrific circumstances.
I have to push back a little here, though. Isn't creating busy work in a crisis just a form of distraction from the real problem? You know, the fact that they were going to starve or die of heat exhaustion.
And that's a fair challenge. It would be mere distraction if Urzúa were just ignoring reality. But he was building a stable base from which to address reality.
Yeah.
They knew they were trapped. Of course they did. But the structure allowed them to address the feelings of being trapped, the despair, the rage, the anxiety, by focusing on actions they could control. If you have a schedule, you can conserve resources. If you have a role, you don't fight with the person next to you. The structure regulated the human nervous system first.
And the power of that internal coherence was proven 17 agonizing days later when the first drill finally found them. They sent up that famous defiant note, "Estamos bien en el refugio los 33."
We are well in the refuge, the 33. It wasn't just a sign of life. It was a testament to emotional resilience that was built entirely through protocol.
And that coherence drives our second principle. Structure is a form of calm. When you feel overwhelmed because you can't control the overarching crisis, the economy, the pandemic, the fact that you're 700 meters underground,
Right.
your brain hunts for control in destructive ways. Blame, obsessive doom forecasting, self-sabotage. Structure is the psychological antidote to that.
And this highlights that concept that under high stress, you don't automatically rise to your intentions, you fall to your protocols.
Yeah.
Your intention might be to be calm and resourceful, but you'll probably fail.
Yeah, that's a nice thought, but...
It's a nice thought. But if your protocol is, in moments of overwhelming chaos,
Yeah.
I immediately start by doing these 3 predictable things, you succeed. Clarity often arrives after you build a stable base of structure, not before. You create the order, and then the answers start to reveal themselves.
So the structure transforms the emotion of helplessness into the psychological state of agency.
Exactly. Agency is that feeling of competence and control over some part of your environment. And that small feeling of control sends a signal to your nervous system that the threat is, in some way, manageable.
So if we're not trapped in a mine, how do we build that immediate agency when our professional life or our personal circumstances feel like a total collapse? Tool 1 is the circle of control scan.
When you are flooded with anxiety, your mind just spirals through 2 categories of concern at the same time. Things you can control and things you can't. The emotional brain spends 90% of its energy arguing with the things it can't control. The past mistake, the global economy, what your competitor thinks. The circle of control scan is a mandatory mental filter. You literally draw the circle, or just mentally filter, for one column only. What I can control in the next 24 hours. The goal is to redirect 100% of your energy to manageable steps. The phone call you need to make, the draft you need to finish, the 15 minutes of preparation.
It instantly grounds you in the present and replaces that paralyzing anxiety of the macro problem with the manageable pressure of the micro task.
Another critical tool for regulating the nervous system is the power of repetition. We call it the 3 anchors routine. When everything external is uncertain, the nervous system trusts predictability. You need 3 non-negotiable fixed points in your day that your emotion can't argue with.
And these don't need to be huge commitments, right?
Not at all. It could be a fixed wake-up time, regardless of what happened the night before. A 15-minute walk where you explicitly leave your phone behind. And a simple, repeatable shutdown ritual at night, closing the laptop, reading 3 pages, whatever it is. The substance matters less than the consistency. The body learns safety through repetition.
And the final tactic for emotional traction is realizing that your identity is a powerful tool for regulating your behavior. Role before emotion.
Right. When you are overwhelmed, you are stuck in the identity of the victim or the overwhelmed individual, but you have multiple identities.
So when the crisis hits, you stop and ask yourself, what is my role in the next 10 minutes? Am I operating as a leader, a focused teammate, a responsible parent?
And defining that role immediately limits the acceptable range of behaviors. If your role is leader, you can't just scream or blame or disappear. If your role is parent, you can't spiral into self-pity. You're replacing that internal chaos with a chosen external identity that has predefined expectations.
That move is a potent form of emotional control. So the ultimate lesson from the Chilean mine is this. When life is chaos, build a routine that your emotions can't argue with. Okay, we're going to transition now to our third principle, which is focused on the emotional control required to navigate a massive, high-profile mistake. And this takes us to the world of corporate reputation and the very painful public reversal executed by Netflix during the Quickster debacle in 2011.
Yeah, this is a brilliant case study because it wasn't a malicious mistake. It was an organizational and emotional failure that was driven by a confusion between strategic necessity and customer perception.
To set the scene for us.
Netflix had built its brand on simple elegance. One account, one queue, one bill for both streaming and DVDs. Super simple.
And then in a move that was designed to split the rapidly growing streaming service from the legacy DVD business, they restructured their pricing.
Right, and for many longtime subscribers who wanted both services, the resulting increase felt like a massive betrayal. It was roughly a 60% price hike. The market reaction was swift, it was emotional, and it was intensely negative.
And this is where that emotional trap for leaders becomes so evident. When an executive or a founder makes a strategic decision, they invest heavily in it, not just financially, but emotionally.
Oh, completely.
So when customers or stakeholders criticize the policy, the leader unconsciously interprets it as a critique of their identity. And the immediate, powerful emotion is defensiveness. They start defending the decision not because the policy is correct, but because they made it.
Initially, CEO Reed Hastings seemed to handle the emotional fallout with maturity. In September 2011, he issued a public, clear admission. I messed up. I owe everyone an explanation.
He demonstrated ownership, right, of the failure of tone and the lack of respect and humility in their communication. That was the emotionally mature first step. He separated the criticism from his immediate worth.
But then came phase two, and this is where the defensiveness started to creep back in. They still needed to split the services, so they introduced Qwikster.
Qwikster, a separate brand, separate website, separate queue, separate bill for DVDs.
It was an unnecessary complexity, introduced right in the middle of a demand for simplicity.
Qwikster was just gasoline on the fire. And internally, the leadership was stuck. They'd invested capital and time in it. Abandoning it felt like a double defeat. Admitting the initial price change was mishandled and admitting the correction was flawed.
You can see how the emotional current shifted. It went from listening to the market to justifying the sunk cost. The urge to win the strategic argument began to override the desire to repair the customer relationship.
This is a classic case of what you call the ego tax.
The ego tax. It's the hidden cost of defending a mistake long after the world has moved on. It's not just driving customers away, it slows down internal communication because nobody wants to be the executive who suggests abandoning the CEO's pet project.
It slows innovation, burns cash on doomed projects, and it destroys team trust because everyone sees the mistake, but they have to pretend it's viable.
The hinge moment, which required immense emotional control, came less than a month later. Hastings reversed the reversal. He pulled the plug on Qwikster entirely. He admitted, effectively, that he needed to stop trying to defend his past actions and focus only on the future.
And that decision demonstrates our third principle. Emotional control is measured by the speed at which you can separate your identity from your decision.
Exactly. The default is criticism equals criticism of me, therefore I must defend. The better controlled habit is criticism is data. I can revise without self-erasure. Humility is the primary control mechanism against that ego tax. The most painful part of being wrong is letting go of the need to justify the past.
I wonder, though, isn't there a time when you have to stick to a decision, even if it's wildly unpopular, because you believe it's strategically sound? How do you distinguish between defensiveness and necessary conviction?
That is the subtlety we have to master. Conviction is based on objective, long-term data and values, which we're going to discuss next. Defensiveness is based on the emotional cost of self-humiliation. Hastings' reversal was emotionally controlled because he stopped asking, does reversing this make me look weak? And he started asking, does sticking to Qwikster serve the customer and the future of Netflix? If the data overwhelmingly says your policy is failing, holding onto it purely to save face is emotional weakness disguised as strategic strength.
So let's build some tools for that kind of quick, controlled revision. We can start with the 3-line ownership script.
This forces structure onto the apology and the action plan. It prevents that rambling, justification-laden communication. Line 1 is, I was wrong about X, and you named the specific policy, not the customer reaction.
Right.
Line 2, the impact was why you quantified the damage to trust, or revenue, or efficiency. Line 3, here's what I'm changing by Z, a specific deadline. It's concise, it takes ownership, and it immediately pivots to repair.
And before you even use that script, you can use a technique called swap defense for discovery.
Yes. When you receive a furious email or intense criticism, your emotional brain immediately prepares a defense. Stop that process. Force yourself to ask one question. What part of this is definitively true?
Even if you think 95% of it is unfair hyperbole.
Even then, the 5% truth is your leverage. Focus on that 5% because that's the starting point for repair that doesn't require you to completely erase yourself.
And remember, if the damage was public to your customers, your team, your market, the repair has to be public too.
Public, absolutely. Private justifications don't rebuild public trust. And to overcome the paralysis of pride, leaders should define the reversal threshold in advance. Make reversal a procedure, not a surrender. Say, if subscriber churn exceeds 5% this quarter, we revert to plan B. This takes the emotional shame out of changing course.
The lesson here is simple, but it's hard. Your ego wants to be right. Your future requires you to be accurate. Our fourth principle takes us even deeper into this idea of emotional outsourcing, relying on pre-chosen values to govern crisis decisions. And this lesson is defined by the legendary response to the Tylenol crisis of 1982 by Johnson & Johnson.
The crisis context here was truly horrific. Multiple sudden deaths in the Chicago area were traced to extra-strength Tylenol capsules that had been laced with cyanide.
And this was unprecedented. It wasn't a manufacturing flaw. This was external malicious tampering. This unleashed national panic.
Under these circumstances, the internal pressure on a massive corporation is just paralyzing. Fear drives the strategy. FEAR says.
You mean,
Contain the bad news, minimize the legal liability, localize the response only to Chicago where the deaths occurred.
right, avoid overreacting to save money in the stock price. The corporate nervous system just contracts violently, prioritizing short-term financial survival.
But the CEO, James Burke, had a powerful, stable anchor, the J&J Credo. This document, written by the founder Robert Wood Johnson in 1943, wasn't just a mission statement, it was an operating constitution.
And it explicitly ranked their responsibilities.
It did. It put their duty to doctors, nurses, and patients, and all consumers first, before shareholders, before management, before profit.
So that credo acted as a non-negotiable brake pedal against the inevitable corporate panic.
Completely. If the Credo is the rule, the decision immediately becomes clear, though staggeringly expensive. A fear-based decision would have been a narrow, localized, legally minimal recall. The Credo-driven decision was massive, comprehensive, and morally defining.
J&J announced a massive nationwide voluntary recall of 31 million bottles of Tylenol.
31 million. It cost an estimated $100 million in direct expenses and lost product. They followed this with a complete halt to capsule production and a national relaunch with new tamper-proof packaging, which created the industry standard we still have today.
And they made this decision even though they knew the threat was localized and their legal liability for external tampering was minimal.
They chose long-term commitment to consumer safety over short-term financial fear. And in the short term, Tylenol's market share plunged from about 35% down to 7%, which just demonstrates the genuine existential stakes of that $100 million choice.
That magnitude of decision-making under fire, it illustrates our fourth principle. Spend calm like currency.
Yeah. In a high-stakes scenario, fear doesn't just show up as trembling, it shows up as strategic distortion. Fear says, delay for more information. Fear says, deny and minimize exposure. Values are the stable currency that buys you long-term calm and stability.
The core lesson, then, is that the best way to control your emotions under pressure is to outsource your decisions to pre-chosen values. Your mood is volatile data. Your values are stable, pre-committed rules.
That Credo created a stable hierarchy that overrode all the internal political debates and financial panic in the executive suite. They chose responsibility, knowing that if they prioritized the $100 million cost today, they would pay an infinitely higher cost in trust tomorrow.
And that's why their response became a business school legend. They modeled values-first leadership, showing that the only way to earn back trust is to accept the short-term pain necessary to honor your long-term commitment. But let's be challenging here for a second. The J&J Credo was written in 1943. In today's environment of instant communication and viral backlash, wouldn't basing a $100 million decision on a decades-old document be seen as too slow, too rigid, maybe even naive?
That is a crucial modern distinction. The age of the document isn't the point, the pre-commitment is the point. The Credo was stable, not rigid. It gave them a non-negotiable standard that was independent of the current moment's fear. Today, companies need to create similar Credo lines or first principles that explicitly address modern threats like data privacy, algorithmic fairness, or environmental impact. When the crisis hits, you don't debate the standard, you simply execute the decision based on the pre-committed standard. That process prevents the fear from overriding rational choice.
So let's talk tools for embedding this pre-commitment. You say we should start by having the discipline to write your Credo lines.
Yes. Define your 3 or 4 ranking sentences. And they have to be hierarchical. For example, customer safety ranks above all else. Team wellness ranks above speed. Long-term reputation ranks above short-term profit.
And in a crisis, you read those lines aloud to the decision-making team.
You do. They stabilize the emotional room by reminding everyone of the shared higher purpose.
We can also introduce the two-cost test.
Right. When you're faced with a scary decision, the emotional brain only counts the immediate financial pain. So you force yourself to ask 2 questions first. What does this cost today? That's the financial immediate cost. The $100 million recall. Second, and more importantly, what does this cost in trust and long-term reputation? Leaders who lose emotional control consistently fail to count that second cost.
And finally, rehearsal is emotional insurance. Run a 15-minute tabletop exercise monthly.
Just simulate a crisis that could happen. Force a quick, value-driven response. If a major client publicly accuses us of a security flaw, what are our first 5 actions, guided by our Credo lines? Rehearsing the scenario reduces the novelty and the associated emotional spike, making the value-driven choice feel procedural rather than heroic.
In a crisis, you don't chase immediate emotional relief. You chase the decision you know you'll respect tomorrow. All right, We move now into our final two-part principle on regulating institutional fear through radical transparency. We're going to examine how leaders use daylight to control impulse and promote accountability. Let's start with the external application. Warren Buffett and the Salomon Brothers scandal of 1991.
The crisis here was a massive credibility issue. Salomon Brothers, one of the most powerful institutions on Wall Street, was caught cheating. They were engaging in illegal bidding in U.S. Treasury auctions.
That's a huge deal.
So when Warren Buffett stepped in as interim chairman, he wasn't just dealing with legal risk. He was fighting the deep, ingrained corporate emotional reflex of secrecy and minimization.
Corporate fear mandates secrecy, doesn't it? Fear tells the executive suite, say as little as possible, limit legal exposure, blame a few lower-level actors, and try to spin your way through the shame.
And Buffett recognized that every time the company minimized the truth, they were purchasing temporary emotional relief with a huge chunk of permanent long-term trust.
So what did he do?
He immediately modeled radical accountability. He personally appeared before a congressional hearing and apologized unequivocally for the firm's actions, promising total cooperation. This act of public self-indictment required immense emotional control because to the corporate ego, publicly admitting error feels like surrender.
But to the institution, it's a profound act of strength.
Exactly. He then instituted his famous control mechanism for all employees, the newspaper test. He told them to conduct their business as if whatever they were about to do, their actions, their emails, their decisions, would appear the next morning on the front page of their local newspaper, read by their spouse, their children, and their friends.
That is a brilliant psychological filter. It forces your brain to simulate the consequences of your actions across your entire identity and across time. You stop focusing on the immediate incentive or the short-term loophole.
And you start calculating the long-term relational and reputational cost. When you're tempted to rationalize a shortcut, you're relying on darkness. Good judgment and emotional control thrive in daylight.
He cemented this emotional mandate with a statement that reset the entire firm's risk profile. Lose money for the firm and I will be understanding. Lose a shred of reputation for the firm and I will be ruthless.
He was fundamentally retraining the firm's fear response. He made it safer to admit a financial failure than to rationalize an ethical shortcut.
That external transparency leads us directly to the internal transparency piece, which is how Alan Mulally turned around Ford Motor Company starting in 2006. When Mulally arrived, Ford was hemorrhaging billions of dollars. Yet, in their high-level executive review meetings, all the presentation slides were colored green.
Everything's fine.
Everything's great. Why green? Because the cultural fear of admitting failure was so pervasive that no leader wanted to be the first one to admit trouble and risk being punished, fired, or shamed.
You can't admit a problem if honesty is more costly than deceit. Fear created this collective institutional delusion that made solutions impossible.
So Mulally, the new CEO, instituted a strict weekly business review system based on a simple status color scheme: red, yellow, green. The goal was simple: make reality visible and therefore solvable.
But it took time to break the culture. For weeks, the slides remained suspiciously green, even amidst massive financial losses. Then came the pivotal moment.
An executive named Mark Fields.
Mark Fields. He finally broke the silence. He marked the status of a major vehicle launch, the Ford Edge, as red it was behind schedule and over budget. And the room, according to all the accounts, just braced for the emotional punishment that had been the norm for decades.
And Mulally completely reset the emotional physics of that room. He looked at the red slide, and he clapped.
He clapped. He rewarded the candor, saying, "Mark, that's great visibility. Is there anything we can do to help?" He sent the unmistakable, vital message. Red was not a personal indictment. It was shared, crucial information. It was permission to solve the problem together.
And that leads to our fifth principle. You regulate emotion by rewarding candor. You cannot fix what you cannot name. And as Mulally famously said, you can't manage a secret.
Most teams fail not from a lack of intelligence, but because fear creates green slides. The controlled leader has to make truth safer than appearance.
Okay, let's get prescriptive on how to build this internal environment. For leaders, we can start with the think, then question rule.
Yes. When a subordinate brings you bad news, especially news that triggers fear or frustration, your first response must always be, out loud, "Thank you for raising this." Only then do you ask investigative questions about the substance. You reward the courage before you engage the issue.
We also want to detoxify the language. Use blame-free language.
Immediately replace the punitive, emotion-driven "who did this" with the systems-focused investigative question, what allowed this to happen? This shifts the entire team's focus from personal defensiveness and shame to system improvement and solutions.
And finally, based on Buffett's model, name the temptation.
If you feel the urge to minimize or hide data, explicitly state it to a trusted colleague. We are tempted to hide this failure because we are scared of the market reaction and the internal backlash. Naming the negative emotion shrinks its power and brings it into the daylight, where it can be governed by the newspaper test.
That is the ultimate maxim for transparency. The moment you stop punishing red, you instantly start earning real green. This has been an incredibly deep dive. I mean, we've moved from the microscopic psychological management of fury to the macroscopic organizational management of institutional fear. Let's try to bring these 5 principles together for the listener.
Yeah, let's do a quick recap. We've established that control is not the absence of heat. It is the presence of a stable, repeatable protocol. A protocol designed to introduce friction between feeling and action.
Okay, 1, containment, modeled by Lincoln's unsent letter. Create the gap by externalizing the emotion onto the page using the draft rule. Let that neurochemical urgency expire.
2, structure, which we learned from the Chilean miners. Build agency through routines. The 3 anchors, the circle of control scan to prevent panic from destroying your psychological resources.
3, ownership, drawn from Netflix's painful reversal. Separate your ego from your decision quickly using the 3-line script to avoid that debilitating ego tax that slows down strategic accuracy.
4, values, exemplified by the Tylenol crisis. Outsource your crisis choices to stable, pre-chosen credo lines to resist the strategic distortions imposed by fear and short-term financial panic.
And 5, transparency, enforced by Buffett and Mulally. Use the daylight of the newspaper test and the celebration of the red slide to dismantle the culture of secrecy and rationalization.
At the end of the day, the goal is always traction toward accuracy, not some kind of emotional perfection.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to carry forward this week. The biggest emotional failure isn't that momentary surge of anger or fear. It's the calculated rationalization. It's the long-term, quiet defense of a shortcut or a mistake you would be deeply ashamed to explain to a stranger, or worse, to your own children.
So think about this honestly. What is one decision, professional or personal, that you are currently defending? Not because it's right or necessary, but purely because admitting error, acknowledging risk, or confronting reality is currently just too emotionally painful. That defense is costing you the ego tax.
Your challenge this week is to use one of the tools we discussed, implementing the draft rule, defining a credo line for a looming decision, or explicitly marking a project red for transparency to make the safer, more accurate move instead of letting your emotional inertia dictate the damage.